January the 4th, 1997. Uh, if you would, please state your name.
I'm John Hencke, Hencke.
You
Right.
are you were a member of the 44th Tank Battalion, early on a member of the 12th Armored Division, later detached to the Pacific. This interview is being taped in Houston, Texas, at the home of Dale and Marion Miller. Mr. Hencke is being interviewed by Vernon Williams, the History Department at Abilene Christian University. Mr. Hencke, if you would, first of all, tell us a little bit about who your parents were, where you grew up.
Okay. My father was from Germany, Hamburg, and when he was 14 years old, he left Germany with his brother to come to the United States to miss the military draft that they had over there at that time. His older brother, Paul, was inducted into the German army, and when the war started, he went through the entire 4 years of the war, and when it was all over with, he came home to peace and quiet, and he couldn't take it. He blew his brains out. And my father and his brother, they did all our jobs, waiter, I guess even cook, because my father turned out to be a pretty good cook. He used to do it on every Sunday. They roamed the entire United States. One story that my father did tell me, but for some reason he was by himself. He was crossing one of the deserts, and he collapsed. And he says that an Indian found him, took him to his hogan or wigwam or whatever, where he lived, and brought him to, fed him a very delicious meal, and it wasn't until later that he found out that he was eating rattlesnake. And my father met my mother somewhere around 1915, 16, and I was born in 17.
Give us their names.
Oh, my father was John Hencke, Hencke. I'm used to that. And my mother was Margaret Brown. Her grandfather was a mortician in New York City, and he had a large following. In other words, he'd been in business for quite some time, and he was very devout Catholic, and he was, in case anybody had died, passed away, families couldn't afford it, he'd always take care of the bodies and put them away properly. He had approximately 50 horses, a large stable, plus carriages. And when he went to the funerals, he'd examine the horses when they got back. If there was a whip mark on them, the driver was fired because there was no hurry to go to a funeral or to come back from one. He was quite an old man, quite a man. And he was involved in real estate besides being a mortician. He gave a lot of donations to a Irish organization. It might have been no. It starts with an F. Finney. They were patriots, and they fought the English. And
What was his name?
his name was James Burke. He died in, I believe, 1922. He's buried in Riverside Cemetery on around 130th Street, somewhere in there. It's a small cemetery, but I've never been by his grave, and I lived in New York for years. But anyway, my mother, naturally, she married my father, and my aunt was an old maid. She had tried to become a nun and had gotten a nervous breakdown, and they passed her over. And but she was always a nun in her mind. She never had a man, to my knowledge. And as a matter of fact, there was only 3 good men in her mind. And the first one was Jesus Christ. And the other 2 were my brother and myself. I'm lost.
What was her name?
Her name was Bessie Brown, Elizabeth Brown. And my mother's was Margaret Patricia Brown.
Tell me a little bit about where you grew up and the household. I mean, if you walked into that house today, in terms of going back in time, standing in the front door, what would you see? Tell us a little bit about where you lived as a young boy growing up.
Okay. Well, we moved every 2 years, I believe. For some reason, everybody had to move after they've lived in a place for 2 years, even if it's just next door. And each and every place had to be entirely cleaned, scrubbed, mopped, everything before they left that house. It was always perfect to come into. Now, the last few years on Auden Street, 14 Auden Street, I'm sorry, it was 12, we lived on the top floor, and the rent was $40 a month. And there was not a winding stairway, it was 2 stairs to every floor, 2 stairways. And growing up, my brother and I, we would start down from the top, 4 steps at a time. That took actually 2 steps to the middle landing, 2 steps down to the next floor, 2 steps down. And we've always said that we could hit the bottom floor after about 6 seconds. We were flying. Going up, we'd make it in about 8 to 10, taking 2 steps at a time. Now this here went on every day, and a dozen times a day. It was a narrow street, but it's a very well-kept neighborhood. It's all tenements, and when I was growing up as a teenager, I was a member of a gang, Suicide Squad, we called ourselves. There was 4 of us, 3 Johns and 1 Tony. We never did anything outside of that name that we had. The worst we did, we had made a raffle, 10 cents a piece, a chance, and we sold those, and to get a quarter keg of beer. And when we had enough money, and we held a raffle, gave the person who had the winning number their money, which might have been about $10, and then we had the profits, a keg of beer, and we carried it to a friend's house and put the spigot, that wooden plug that goes in there. They have to pound in there. And we had beer all over the ceiling. But that was about the maximum of my foolishness, if you want to call it that.
What do you remember about your dad? Looking back, what kind of person was he? What stands out in your memory?
Well, now my father, he was, you might as well say, a man of all trades. He was a carpenter, a painter, a waiter, and he might have done some cooking because, as I said, he always cooked the Sunday dinner, and it was usually delicious. Now, this here was before the Depression. When the Depression started, my father, I'm sorry, I'll take that back. At the time that the Depression started, he was working for Tom and Gann stores. He had a contract with them to whitewash every store, and he'd do it periodically going around. And he had a very, very good contract for that time. A $200 check was very, very good. But we never saw it. There was a speakeasy on the corner, and it was very handy when he passed by. Somebody would call him in, and there would go the paycheck. We had to go in, get his attention, to get some money so we could pay some of the bills and buy food for the following week. Now, during the Depression, for some reason, my father lost the contract, and he started looking for work. He left us and went to surrounding cities. And the last I heard of him was in around 1933. He had a job in Detroit, Michigan, and he was staying at the Hotel Griswold. He left the Hotel Griswold on New Year's Eve to find a promise of another job in the city right across the river. I don't know what city that was, but it was either Cincinnati or, no, couldn't have been. But anyway, he never made it. He disappeared from this earth. I read a book several years later about murdered transits that were found in a railroad yard, and they had been not hacked. Now, the first bodies were hacked. There was no head, no arms, no legs, just the torsos, and they were cut up, butchered, and the latter part of them, after a certain length of time, they were clean cut and surgically using technique. It must have been students going to college, learning the medical profession, and there was an awful lot of transits and tramps, and they were a very good supply of bodies. Never did find out if one of those was my father, but I really believe that they were, that he was. My mother woke up in 1936 with a dream about him, and she said, he's dead. And so that was the end of my father. Now, my mother never did remarry. She raised myself and my brother. We both went out to work. I went and got a delivery boy job and went to school. I delivered vegetables for a Jewish store across the way, and the woman there was pregnant, but I didn't know it. I was not told what happens with women when they have babies. All I thought was she was quite a large woman. And I was really astonished when they said, well, she had a baby yesterday. And, but I didn't have any knowledge of girls until I was about 19 years old and working in the hotel. But I worked for a tailor shop, $4 a week. I came in, now this during the summer, I came in and counted the money, made sure everything was right, took care of the clothes that came in, delivered what was already ready. I pressed the clothes, sent the others that needed cleaning out to the cleaner, who was the owner's son. And he and I didn't get along very well, although he never did say anything to me. He disliked me because I smiled too much. I always had a smile on my face and greeted everybody the way that I felt like everybody should. I went to work then after I left him to Armenians and did almost the same thing, and went on to college and get home 4 o'clock, work till 7 or 8, and go home. After that, I worked for a vegetable store for $8 a week. I was delivery boy, salesman, and cleanup. It was an Italian place, and they were real nice. As a matter of fact, one time, they had given me some money for change, and I forgot that I had it. And they had forgotten that they had given it to me. Well, I discovered it in my pocket that evening, and my mother said, take it back to them right now. And which I did, and returned the money to them with the customers' added amount to it. I worked for them for a year, and my brother took my job over. When I went to work for Cornell Dubilier, they made condensers and for the Navy and radio, and that time there was no television or anything like that. I worked for them for another year. I was making 32 cents an hour and 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And I think my paycheck came to about $22 or no, 10, 6. It was $3.20 a day. 6 times that was, I believe it came to approximately 19, 20, maybe $21. Out of that, I gave the money to my mother. We paid our rent and bought the food. And at that time, I don't believe that the rent was $40, but during the wartime, it had gone up to that, and then it was frozen. They couldn't raise the rents, and eventually, after I didn't come home, my brother had married, Uh, my mother sold an apartment for, I believe, $500 and moved into a one-room at another place, number 1 Arden Street. She lived there for a number of years and found out she had cancer. My sister at that time had moved to El Paso, and her and her husband were in the restaurant business, and they had just started, but they said, come on down here, and they put my mother into the hospital and operated on her colon, and she seemed like she was doing real good for about 10 years, and it started all over again. She finally passed away in 68, I think.
What about your sister? You hadn't mentioned her before.
I'm sorry.
Was she younger than the two of you, the boys?
No, she was the oldest. And she was my half-sister. My mother had been married before she met my father. And she had my sister. And somewhere around 15 or 16, my sister had stayed out all night with a friend of hers, Dixie Severs. And of course, Dixie had a brother. And my mother thought that there was some hanky-panky going on. And she had a fight with my sister, and my sister either was thrown out or she walked out on her own. But she went and worked for Horn and Hardart, and the only restaurant that they had that actually had waitresses to serve the tables. And she has a lot of stories, or had a lot of stories, she just passed away, about the restaurant business, about the people coming in, and they didn't have money to buy food. Now, they could always get hot water and a cup and sit down at one of the tables, and when nobody was looking, they would take the ketchup and put it into the hot water, stir it up a little bit with their finger, and they had soup. They had to watch out for that, but a lot of times they just turned their heads because people were hungry. She remarried, my sister married a German, and he and her, he was the cook and she was the waitress. They worked together quite a while, and he would drink quite a bit and get very mad from the drink, and eventually my sister had to leave him. But she had given birth to one child, Eric, and I would take him out in the wintertime on my shoulders and go sleigh riding with him and everything like that. He was quite a little boy. My sister eventually, after the war, she married another man. His name was Jerry Wolf. He was a Jewish fellow, real nice. When I say real nice, he was better than nice. He never spoke with a curse word. He never told a dirty joke. He would take us, when we went to Juarez after they moved down to El Paso, he'd take us into these nightclubs if we wanted to go, showed us a lot of entertainment, but as soon as the people that told these off-color jokes, he would move out, and he would never drink. He'd always have a Coke. He passed away in the 70s, I believe, early 70s. He had gotten up, choked, and died at the edge of his bed. He'd swallowed something and he couldn't get any air down into his lungs. My sister went on. At that time, they had been expanding in the restaurant business. They had a contract with Roadway, and they put a restaurant in, Jerry Wolf's restaurant, in each one. And I believe there was about 5 when he passed away. Of course, my sister really didn't have that end of the business. He was always the brain. And my sister had to take over. And she did let some of the restaurants go, but she kept 3. One was Las Cruces, one was in El Paso, and the other one was at the Six Flags in Arlington. And she said of all of the restaurants, that one paid off more in the time when they were open, the season, than the others all put together for the entire year made in that same length of time. And she went into business with some others and opened up a restaurant in El Paso, in Juarez. And that went kaput because of poor books that were kept over in Juarez, because anything over in Mexico had to be, the executives had to be Mexican, and all you could tell them was what you expected of them, but you couldn't handle the money. Of course, my sister lost it because they didn't pay any taxes. And after that, she bought the Sheraton Hotel in El Paso, which had been closed, and she made quite a loan to finance the redoing of the hotel and the restaurants. And she had remarried after 9 years of being a widow. And this fellow, he was was an instrument man, so he helped out as far as the equipment and everything. And they got kind of suspicious of the management over there in the Sheraton. Well, they had changed the name to Sheraton, to Mesa. And every so often, there, in a very short space of time, the air conditioner would go out, and they would receive a bill of approximately $20,000 for redoing something. And this went on maybe 3 or 4 times, and John went over there, and they were really making a lot of money off my sister. They had kind of like an understanding between the management that she had over there and this air conditioning place. And finally she just had to sell the hotel, and luckily she was able to get somebody with a lot of money to take it over. And she still had the one in the Roadway, the original one that they were in, and she kept that till she retired in 72, when she was 72. She had never been really sick before then, and after that she just fell apart. Everything went wrong with her.
Where
Now,
were you during all of this? Were you living in El Paso?
no, no. They had originally been, her and Jerry had originally been sent.
Just go ahead and flip it to be sure it's
Yeah.
up there.
Uh, they had originally been sent down to El Paso by one of the airlines. My sister had a job out at one of the airports in New York, and they were sent down there because man and wife rather than a single person, because they fellows would Boys Town was right over the river, and they go crazy. It was available, and they wanted somebody that would stay with them. And in a year's time, they turned that airport. See, they put the meals, cook the meals, and everything to put on the planes. And they and the restaurant there, and they put that into the red rather than on the losing side. And
So where were you during all
oh,
of this?
I forgot. I was in.
This is the what, the late 30s?
No, this here's on. This here is way back up into the 70s.
Oh, okay.
See now.
Well, let's bring you back to the 30s and pick up the story of what you're doing. Let's say the late 30s, towards the end of the Depression, before the war, but the war is beginning to approach.
Right.
Hitler's making some noises in Europe. What are you doing at that point?
Okay. I was working in. As I said, I had worked with Cornell Duvalier, and they closed their doors. They didn't bankrupt or anything like that. They were just moving their factory to Plainville, I believe it was, New Jersey, because the taxes in New York City were just ruining them. And they just took their key personnel over there, and everybody, uh, they closed up the doors about 9 days before Christmas. And I worked the graveyard shift, got off at 8 o'clock in the morning, took the subway down to Lower Manhattan, went to a employment agency, and they sent me out almost immediately to a place that was needing some help, and I stuffed calendars into a tube for 2 days. I believe I got 50 cents an hour at that time from them. And that was the end of that job. I went back, and they sent me out to another one, and it was delivering books for the Christmas. And I got $9, I believe, for the rest between that and Christmas Eve. And the day after Christmas, I was back there looking for work, and they sent me to the Hotel New Yorker, where I was for 5 more years. I started out as, I don't know what you would call me, but I worked for the housekeeping department and the room clerks. The room clerks would get paid for a room, cashiers, and they'd put a slip over, and I'd pick the slip up, take it upstairs, put it in a slot for the maids, and they would immediately go and clean that room up. And Now the Hotel New York was 40 stories tall, and I'd take the elevator up and walk down naturally, and I did that about 8 times a day. And every time I'd come back down, I'd collect these slips, take them over to the room clerk, and they had a room that they could sell to the customers. I worked in that for about a year, and then I asked for another job. I was only making $14 a week, and I got another job over a little bit of a raise in the mail-in information where I was for about 3 years. And then I asked for another position with the cashiers, and I think I got $18 a week. And it was working straight graveyards. And we come in at midnight, pick up all the cashier's receipts in the 4 restaurants that they had in the bar, and carry them back up to the office and sit there with numbers all for the rest of the evening. When the war started, everybody was going to work for industry, and the prices, salaries were supposed to be going sky high where you could make a lot of money. I applied in several places for in industrial, but I had no skills, and so I went back to the employment agency. I was still working with the Hotel New Yorker, and they sent me out to Guarantee Trust Company, and I got a job immediately in one of their offices with stocks and bonds. And I went back to the Hotel New Yorker and told them that I'd work a week, but I had another job, and I was through. Well, the next morning, the office manager had left a note for me to see him the next morning, and which I hung around till 9 o'clock to see what he had to say, and he offered me $2 more, which would have made it $22 to stay with them. And I said, well, why should I stay here? I'm going to be making 25, and they've already told me that I had a bonus at the end of the year, and 2 weeks vacation, where I was only getting one for every, well, I was making one week vacation. The hotel had been built in 1928, and when they opened up, they offered 1 day for every year that it stayed open. It was open, and I just started there when it hit a week, and that's all they would give was one week from then on. And so 2 weeks vacation was quite a treat for me. And I worked with them until the time that I got my greetings from the Army, and I got inducted, and we had 2 weeks to settle our affairs, and I worked those 2 weeks with the Guarantee Trust Company, and went from there into the service. And
What were you doing when Pearl Harbor took place? What do you remember about that day?
I was working in the hotel on the desk, and it was about 11 o'clock in the morning when I heard about it. And really the feeling I couldn't describe because it's been so long ago, but it was shock that a little nation could challenge, you might as well say, a big one like we are. And if I may go back, in 1936, I went for 2 weeks to a camp in Pine Camp, I believe it was, in New York State. I was an orderly with a captain, 2 lieutenants. I was not in the service or in the National Guard, which they were in, and they were holding maneuvers with the First Army.
What was your role there? I mean, how come you were there then?
They just paid me out of their pockets, $1 a day for a week. And I shined their shoes and mixed their drinks, and I was a gopher. Whatever they wanted me to more or less do, I'd have to go and do it. And I enjoyed myself. And but what I brought it up for was that the equipment that they had. Now, this here was the National Guard that I was with, and they were issued not guns, but a broomstick and a stock. That was their rifle. Artillery was something laid over 2 wheels and pulled like a wheelbarrow. There was another one that they had, old bazookas, a pipe sticking in the ground, and but the equipment was very, very scarce. Now the regular Army had their rifles and equipment, but the National Guard didn't. But I brought this up in 1st Cavalry. I saw that, and 10 years later, which was when I was in Manila, riding a big tank, they didn't have anything then. 10 years later, we had tanks, everything, planes, bombers, and it was an entirely different world. And bring me back to track.
Let's pick up where you were on enlistment day. What happened to you when you went down to be inducted? What do you remember about that wonderful day?
Well, first of all, there's a bunch of naked old, well, not old men, but young men all over the place, and scared. And at that time, I was 27 years old. And a lot of these here were kids, just 17, 18 years old. And I thought I knew a little bit about the world, which I didn't. But I took it in stride. And when they said cough, I coughed. And when they asked me about did I like girls, I said yes. And other foolish questions that they did ask, because I think that if you came in on a crutch, they'd thump your back and say you were fine, ready to go, because after I got into service, I was with a man who had been a miner in a coal mine and had lost his lung, and he only had one lung. And he was finally discharged after well over a year. And I know about that because I had asthma, and I had to go to a doctor, and they gave us both the Lipidol test, which was they had to put a brownish liquid down into our lungs. It wasn't iodine, but it was Odgerol, I believe is what it was. It didn't burn or anything like that, but it was supposed to be anesthetic. And they poured it into our lungs after they deadened our breathing tubes and tilted us all over the place and took x-rays. And naturally, I went back to the service and he was out. But it was so hard on him that they had to put him in a wheelchair to bring back to the ward. And me, I was walking right alongside him and was, here, let me open the door. And I stuck my hand out just as soon as somebody pushed from the other side. First thing I did, I jammed my finger back. It swelled all the way up. And the next day, I think, was going to be Thanksgiving. And I talked my way out of the hospital with that finger all tied up and swollen. But I was through with that hospital. I didn't want any more of it. But I went back to the company. By that time, the bunch that I had been with had already gone on, and I had to start all over with another new bunch of fellas. But I was, like, say, 4 weeks ahead of them.
What year would this be?
42. And they sent me to Camp Campbell. I spent 6 months in a school learning mechanics because I was supposed to have some mechanical experience because I went to high school to learn aviation mechanics, and I might have picked up a wrench once or twice. But anyway, I went to the mechanical school and learned how to hopefully repair some of the machinery. And when I got to the 12th Armored and assigned to Company B, somehow they were going through assignments. And I went through gunner school, or that part of it, and I must have made a pretty good score because I became a gunner, even though I had 6 months of mechanic behind me. But then from then on, I was a gunner, and usually I was in the commander's tank. And one time I had come in from a furlough, and I got into the barracks, and I was there with about 5 fellas, and they came out and they were looking for a volunteer, and it was me, and they gave me a gun, and they carried me to the stockade, and I picked up a prisoner. It was a fellow who had gone AWOL, and they had gone to his home, Peach Orchard or something like that, and he was a country boy. And brought him back to the company, and I told him, well, what have you been doing? He says, I sweep up a little bit and wash the windows. I said, okay. So he started washing the windows. The other 4 fellows that were there, and they started playing cards. Well, before you know it, my prisoner was looking over their shoulder, and before you know it, he was already in the game. And after maybe an hour, 15 minutes, whatever it was, attention, and a colonel came in. And he saw me with my rifle. He says, "Where's your prisoner?" I said, "Over there." Well, by that time, this fella had jumped up and got behind the bunks, and he was rubbing that glass. And but the four fellows were in between me and him. And that colonel chewed me out from one end to the other, allowing a prisoner to be that far away from me and having somebody else be in front of him. I don't know whether that gun was loaded, but I sure felt like using it on him. But anyway, I lost my stripes, and the lieutenant said, "That's all right." He said, "Next month I'll put you in for another." Because the gunners usually had corporal stripes, or T5 at that time. And when I finally, we went on maneuvers, and I had a driver. His name was Deming, Cecil Deming. And he and I were pretty good buddies. He was a lot younger than I was. And he'd come in and talk about his girlfriend and all of that. And I'd either try it, but I was a good ear. I listened. And he and I got to be very, very good friends. But this one day, we were going to go to take all our tanks and everything to decontamination, showing us how to wash a tank down after it's been sprayed with gas. But for some reason, Deming was transferred to another tank, and they put another driver in his place that I was not familiar with. And I knew what Deming, he was a very good driver, and he knew when to put a tank in park, in gear, whatever. But this other fella, when we went to the area that the test was supposed to be, or the school was, we were facing down on, we were up on top of a mountain, or a small mountain. Every tank had to be almost at a 45-degree angle, or maybe not quite that severe. But anyway, facing down. And he put just a brake on. Well, the brake consisted of a round brake shoes that went around the flywheel of the tank. And he didn't put it in gear or anything like that, which would have added more braking power to it. But anyway, I'm bringing that up because the story goes on. We all dismounted. The class hadn't started yet, and I always had a book. So I got out, got down in front of the tank, and leaned up against the track and started reading. Well, for some reason, I looked up and I saw that 75 sticking out over my head. And I said to myself, I wasn't loud or anything like that. I said, "Boy, if this here tank moves, it's goodbye Johnny." Well, now, Deming was over talking to a group, and for some reason, he heard me. And he came over, and he scooped me up, just like a baby. Carried me about 5 feet, put me down behind a little tree, and he says, "Now you're safe." Well, he had no sooner said that, but we heard a creak, and that tank was already gone over the spot that I had been sitting in and continue on down the side of the hill for 15 or 20 feet before he hit a large enough tree to stop it. And I'll remember that to my dying day. But he forgot it. I called him up several years after I was found, and I said something about it. He says, "I did that?" I said, "Yeah, you sure did." But I lost my track again.
Well, what happened then? You were in the maneuvers.
Yeah. Yeah, we got into maneuvers.
Any other memories of that period? That's just
It was
before
cold, very, very cold. We went
in
into,
Tennessee.
yeah, and we went up and down the mountains in Tennessee, and one time a Lieutenant Berg or something, I can't really remember what his last name was. He got into the tank, and by that time, I think I had Trujillo as driver. I'm not positive, but this lieutenant came in, it got in the tank, and we got out there, and we were supposed to be finding the enemy, and turn right, turn right. A few more minutes, turn right. We wound up 8 miles away from the camp, completely lost, and they had to send somebody out to so we could follow them back to camp. But
At what point did the final crew come together? In other words, the crew that you ended up with in Manila, at what point did you finally arrive at having that group together? Was that in Tennessee or later?
I'll tell you, I can't really remember because we spent 6 months in Abilene, or 3 months, and I think in that time was when the crew finally came together, but I'm not positive. But it was Trujillo driver and Heinrich. He was my radio man, myself, and we never did really have a assistant driver. Always somebody that they put in there. And when I was up at the camp and I gave a little talk to a platoon of tankers, somebody asked me why our tank was named Battling Basic. And I told them that the only reason I could think of was that I asked the party, I said, "You know what basic is?" And they said, "Yes." I said, "That's the bottom of the barrel." I said, the captain was usually gone. Very seldom had an assistant driver, so that just left the three of us. And we became so good at cleaning the tank and the guns, we were usually the first ones that was ready. And we learned the hard way that we were also the first ones available to do some more shooting. And then we'd have to clean it all over again.
Who
And
was the captain?
Captain Walters, he was a fine man. He was very lenient in a lot of ways, but he also wanted certain things done. But you could talk to him like a human being, not like a peon to a officer.
When do you remember the first point where he became part of your tank crew? In other words, was that from the very beginning in Campbell?
I believe it was. I believe he was with the maneuvers, and but I've always been in the captain's tank. That's most of my memory.
What do you remember else about the maneuvers? Anything special?
Uh,
The kinds of things you did, that kind of thing? Do before you
Well,
moved on to Abilene?
we learned that a tank can do almost anything, but then there's certain things that it can't do, like sliding down a snow-covered hill. But that really didn't have anything to do with the South Pacific, where we finally wound up in. But we had sliding mud over there where we did a little sliding on some of the mountains. But it was bitter cold on maneuvers, and one of the exercises we got captured by the enemy, and oh, before that we had come over a hill, well, small mountain, whatever you want to call it, and it was like in layers. The outcropping would come out, and then it would drop off. It was like a small pyramid, if you want to call it. And we had come up the side of this one and got up on top, and there was an airfield of the enemy down below us. And a plane started taking off, and I fired on it, 75 blank. And of course, I had me a plane. But then trying to get down from the top of that mountain, we had to go project half over the little drop and bring it down, and then we could go around and then make a drastic turn, go down on the ledge, then go down to another spot that looked as not as steep, and we wound all down that mountain to the flatland, and we went on maneuvers at one time, and of course we'd been out on the field for quite some time, and the boys, some of them liked to drink, and we went in there, and we had, I believe this fellow was my assistant driver at that time. I can't remember his last name, but he came from San Angelo. And he was a rooter-tooter. And he always, I guess the word is regaling, telling stories of his life on the ranch, and grabbing a rattlesnake and twisting it over his head and snapping the head off, and such stories as that. And he was a little bitty short fellow, yeah, and I am short, but he didn't quite come up to me. But he was up by himself, and he got into a place, and he was thrown out of it. Now, we came up about the time that he was being thrown out onto the street. Oh, he was mad. And we were across the street from him. There was a trolley track going down the middle of the street. And at that time, the electrical wires were held up by posts, maybe 4 to 6 inches thick, steel posts. And he was so mad that he hauled off and hit that post. And I will swear on a stack of Bibles that it was just like a sledgehammer hitting that post. We heard it from across the street. Well, we couldn't cross it right there to get to him, but we went down to the corner, came across, and by that time, he had gone around the corner, and he was beating the side of the building with his fists. And would you believe that he didn't even scratch his fingers? But he was mad. I've never seen somebody that was as mad as he was. Of course, we took him back to camp. And there's another little story, but I'll forget about that one. It's got nothing to do with this. But anyway, some of the boys, they got themselves some girlfriends and went out. One of them got her into trouble, and they had to come over. That was about the last of the maneuvers. And of course, he just came back to camp with us, and they didn't try to even reach him till we were getting on the ship in Portland, Oregon. And the provost marshal, MPs came and took him off the ship. He got one of those little girls pregnant. They were schoolgirls. And I don't know whether he wound up marrying the girl or went to jail or what. But I'll always remember that. But outside of that, we finished maneuvers, got on the train, and first time we ever saw any sleepers, and luckily we had one. We had a colored porter, and he'd go up and down the car singing, I Got a Paper Doll. Do you remember that song? And but anyway, he'd sing that continually, and it was, I got a paper doll that I can call my own. And anybody with a real live girl, he still had that to call his own. But anyway, he sang it and sang it and sang it. But I think we covered the United States. There was 2 trains altogether that started out. One went one way, the one I was in went another way. And I think it took about 4 days to get to Portland, to that camp that we were.
So you're talking about the train ride from Abilene?
No, yeah.
Okay. What about, before we get to that, let's cover the Abilene period. You're back in maneuvers, getting ready to board a train, I assume, or do you come in convoy, truck convoy,
No,
to Abilene?
Believe it or not, I forgot.
Anything you remember about maneuvers or Campbell that you want to insert here before we move on to Abilene and Camp Barclay?
No. I can bring up something that the Army convoys know. The front of the convoy could start off 30 miles an hour. The back end is doing 60. And we were usually in the back end of the convoy, always rushing, catch up, stopping, rushing to catch up. Always seemed like that they were, that front had to be flying, but they were only doing 30 miles an hour.
What's your first memory of Texas?
Cold. We went out on, after 3 months of maneuvers, we went out on a field trip.
Now, is this at Barclay?
This is Barclay.
Okay.
And we went out into the mesquite country. I had learned on maneuvers how to take my blankets and fold them where I would have 3 below me, 6 on top of me, because it was cold. I usually have pine boughs underneath me, which I did this night. I had a combat suit on, heavy winter underwear, got into my little pup tent. See, I usually had my pup tent to winterize the blankets, but there was 2 to a tent, and so the pup tent was over us, so it was just the blankets on our bodies, but we froze. I have never been so cold in my life. And the next morning, we got out of the tent, and all we could see was just these little small trees, a frost all over the ground. And I think that we had, if I'm not mistaken, we had to find the rest of the company because for some reason we were either isolated or something like that.
What do you remember about the base itself, Camp Barkley? Could you describe the company area where the 44th was? In other words, what kind of living conditions, recreational time that you had in Abilene, that kind of thing?
Well, as far as the barracks go, it was 2-story, and boy, I'll tell you, I am forgetful. That was Campbell. The barracks in Barkley were plywood shacks, and I think that they held about 10 cots to each shack. They were 1/4 inch, and I believe that every crack where they joined was open because that wind would come through, and it was cold all the time. We had a potbelly stove to warm the area, and this fellow Dylan one time, he went into Abilene. He wound up on my tank in Manila. He went into town. He was an older man. I guess he might have been in his 40s. I don't know. But anyway, he went into town, and he got pretty well stewed. Well, by the time he got back to camp, it was wee hours of the morning. The rest of us were already in bed, and he stumbled into his bed, and the urge hit him. And he got up, and he thought he was in the bathroom. Well, my cot was right there next to him, and I got it. Needless to say, I woke up in a hurry. And that is one of my most vivid memories there. But as far as the recreation, I'm trying to think whether we did have. Yeah, we had to have a rec room and orderly room, and that was a regular building. You know, and usually painted white. And we had to go, the ones who didn't have basic training with the 12th had to take their basic training all over again. And I was one of them. And the rest of them went on leave for, their 8 or 10 days, or 2 weeks. And we had to do our firing and our marching and calisthenics and all of that. And the time just kept on slipping away. Rumors were that we were going to go overseas pretty fast. And finally, we had already made up our minds. There was about 5 or 6 of us that if we didn't get our furloughs to go home, at least to see our families before we had to go overseas, we were going to go over the hill so that we could go. Well, they came out and said that we were allowed to. I got an 8-day pass to go to New York. And I'm trying to think of a name of this fellow. He lived in Plattsburgh, New York. I believe he had about 4 hours when he got home. That's all the time that was left. We got to New York, and he had to take another train or shuttles or whatever to get to New York, up to Plattsburgh, and it just ate up all the time. And he only had 4 hours with his family, and he had to redo that whole thing back to camp, and that was the last time he saw him. He was killed. And he was a fine fellow.
What happened to you on that trip? Did you have the same small
to New
amount
York?
of time?
No, I had about 2 days. Of course, it took about, we had to, over the night that we started out, the train had already left from Abilene. So we hired a car. I think it cost us about $8 a piece. And we had that car stuffed to drive us to Fort Worth so we could catch another train to New York. And I think it took us almost 6 hours to go from Abilene to Fort Worth, because I think that they had several blowouts, and they had these reconditioned tires that weren't any good, but they had to change them. We finally got it just in time to catch the train to New York, and I got on there without any problems, and went home. Saw my old girlfriend, which is not my wife, but I saw her and went out the night before. I had to, no, I'm sorry. Memories just keep on jumping around, skidding from here to there. My old girlfriend came down to with me down to Grand Central, where I caught my train, and she said, "Now don't let any of those nurses marry you." Famous last words. It wasn't a nurse.
Where did you meet your wife then?
I had met my wife several years before in New York. She had graduated when she was 17, and for a graduation present, her sister, who had married and was living in New York and had become pregnant with expecting, sent her and her husband sent her a ticket so that Doris could come up and kind of help her out while she was pregnant. And when they got there, I was working with the husband. And
Which was where? At the hotel?
At the hotel. He was one of the night clerks in cashiers. And I mentioned something, Labor Day was coming up, and my buddy, his girlfriend, were going up the Hudson River in one of the dayliners, and I said, well, I didn't have a girlfriend. I had asked everybody I knew, but I had waited too long. I even asked, and it was a nice girl, but she was a 6-footer, built accordingly, and her name was Olga, and I believe she was Polish, either that or Swedish. But she and I, after work, would go over to the Travelers Restaurant, and she'd usually get off before I did, and she'd sit down at the bar, and I'd come in, I'd sit next to her. When you're sitting down, there's really no difference in your height too much, but we were Mutt and Jeff when we were leaving. But we were just good friends. No hanky-panky, not even kissing or anything like that. We just went out, enjoyed ourselves, and I took her to the subway. She got on her train. I got on mine. And we did that for quite some time. But even she had a date. And so I had told Herbie, who was my future brother-in-law at the time, that I didn't have a girl. He says, I got your date. He says, my wife's sister came up and can take her out. So he got home and he says, I got your date. Be ready at 8 o'clock in the morning. We'd never seen each other. And knocked on the door. Here came that little girl. And she's dressed in a kind of a brownish suit that her mother had, a dress that her mother had made. And she looked pretty, but she was just a kid. And we went out, introduced ourselves to each other. And, she said she was kind of scared of this city slicker, white shoes, tan gabardine suit, and pretty well dressed. Anyway, we got onto the boat. We went up to Bear Mountain, I believe it was, or Indian Point, and got along real good, just friends. On the boat, for some reason, it was evening, and John and Joan were sitting next to me, but Doris had sat down right behind us. The backs of the seats came together. So when I turned around to look at her or to talk to her, I had to kind of throw my head back, and she had to do the same thing. And at one point, we both turned around at the same time. And there was her face, and there was my face. And so I kissed her. And from there, it led to a couple of more kisses. And I said, John, I'll see you after a while. And Doris and I went up to the, top deck anyway. And there wasn't so many lights. But anyway, I kissed her some more and made a date with her for the following day. She worked she had gotten her job at the Five and Dime store. You know that old store. And I'd pick her up every night when she got off. And, or when I was available. Because, see, I was working shift work all the time. And usually we went up to a place called Nettix and had a hot dog and a glass of orange juice, and I'd take her home. And several times we went out. Usually we did everything that didn't cost anything, except for one time. And I took her to the rodeo in Madison Square Garden. Well, my seats were all I could afford. It was up in the top balcony, and one of them was behind a post. Luckily for me, she was light. She sat on my lap. That's the only way either whoever sat behind that post would be craning just to see what was going on. But anyway, it was more comfortable having her sit on my lap. And we were so high that our view extended out halfway into the arena. And everything started from down in here, which was out of our sight, and the calves would take a great big run out there and wind up back here, out of our sight again. And so that was our seeing a rodeo. Now, Doris had seen plenty of rodeos down here in Texas, but that was my first one. and I was very, very disappointed. But anyway, uh, Herbie at that time was working with us, and his wife was pregnant, and she decided that she wanted the baby with a mama. And she talked him into quitting, and they bought a Macy's delivery truck, which is maybe a little smaller than the UPS runs around with now. And they loaded five rooms of furniture in that thing. She had measured it by the cubic feet and the shape of each article before she even put one thing in that truck. And the only thing that didn't fit in there was one mattress, and that went on the top of it. But they had to tie the door handles together with a rope in the rear to keep it from flopping open. And they went through Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and my Doris went back home with them. And they said that up the hills, some of it was so steep that the everything inside would slide back against the door, and they could swear that they were going to lose everything. But it took them about 5 days because they broke down several times in that old truck. And they had Texas or bust and all of those writings all over it. But they made it, and he got a job at Humble at that time as a guard, and he loved guns anyway. And he was stationed out in the guardhouse, and every so often there would be a scare, saboteurs coming in, and he had to fire his gun several times at shadows. But anyway, I lost my train of thought.
Well, what happened? You're left in New York.
Oh, I went to
connect up again. Is it when you get back to Barclay? Or it was...
Yeah.
Now, somewhere along the line you said that you were married when you went to war, so
Yeah.
how did that happen?
Yeah.
You've got to find her
That-
again, she's gone.
That happened real fast. In the time that she left, which was several months before I had to go into service, I picked up with this old girlfriend of mine again. And at that time, I was pretty serious about her, but I couldn't marry her. She had been separated from her husband, and he disappeared. And she didn't know where he was, and she had to declare him legally dead. But they had a standing law that they had to be declared illegally dead for 7 years before she could remarry or anything else. And she had a little boy, and I think he was about 6 then. But anyway, she and I were pretty close. And she was with me when I went back the last time back to my last furlough. And when I got to the camp, I was supposed to have gone down to see Doris. She had written to me, and I said I'd be down there, but I didn't have any time to do it. And so she came up to the camp. And when she got there, this Heinrich's girlfriend had been there for several days already and was fixing to go home, but she had a room in this motel, and Doris was going to take it over from her. But then she decided to stay with Doris at that time. She was my girlfriend. And I was a stinker. But anyway, she we were on alert. We couldn't leave the camp until 4 o'clock. And so every day we'd wait till 4 o'clock and we'd usually take off for town. Well, when she got there, it was earlier than that, so she got a cab and came out with Heinrich's girlfriend. And she was in the orderly room, and they, sent for me, and I went down there. We visited. And then when 4 o'clock came, we all tumbled into this one fellow, Ping, I believe it was. I'm not even positive. He was a pharmacist in San Antonio. Anyway, he had a car, and we piled into his, and some of the boys said something to her because she was already kissing me. And she says, "What do you think I came up here for?" She says, "Not to sit in a room staring at four walls." And but that was all it was just kissing. Nothing ever happened outside of that. And so she stayed there a week and doing that same thing, 4 o'clock, and we'd have to be back at camp at 11. Am I talking too much? All right. And so when I put her on the bus along with Heinrich, Heinrich was with me, and his girlfriend was alongside of Doris that had to go to, it might have been Fort Worth, to change buses, then they go their separate ways. Doris back to Katy and girlfriend back to Enid, Oklahoma. But anyway, when they got in that bus and sat down, they both busted out crying. Well, I couldn't take it. Yeah, she had made up her mind that she'd never see me again. She knew that I'd never be back to Texas. But anyway, I went to the captain the next day and said, I want to get married. And he says, okay. He says, you've got to have your Wasserman test and all of this. And he gave me a pass to go to the hospital to get all my tests done. And when I got my results back, the last office, they said to go to this other office. Now, I still don't remember what office that was, but I was going up and down those corridors, and I finally went into one office, and I told them, I said, I just had my Wasserman test, and I was told to come to someplace else. I said, I don't know where I'm supposed to be going. And the fellow stood up and he says, you came to the right place. They were head doctors. Psychologists. Anyway, they always had a pretty good laugh about that. And I went back to the camp and showed the captain that I had all my results. And he said, well, I'll give you a 3-day pass. He said, but I'll give you 2 of them, one ending where the other one starts. So I got to the bus station and picked up the phone. Dialed my wife. She was at work. She worked in a gas station. She sold the bus tickets. And I got a hold of her, and I said, do you know anybody down there that wants to get married? And she says, yes. I said, all right, tell them I'll be there at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning in Houston. All right. And she put the phone down. Now here's what her boss says. She put the phone down, sat down there for a second, jumped up, and it might have been 100 feet to the highway at that time. She ran all the way out there, turned around, came back, and said, "I'm getting married." And they ran all the way home, which was, well, she went home fast, I'll put it that way. Uh, so next morning, she was there in Houston with her sister and Herbie, and they made arrangements to register. See, I didn't have a license or anything like that. So we got all of that behind us, got out to the town, and went to see the pastor. And he was gone at the time. He had one passing away, and he wanted to be with them. And he got finally free about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By that time, I was dead because I didn't have any sleep whatsoever on that bus. I stood up most of it. And anyway, the pastor came in, and word went out to Doris' family to come in, and some of them were in their work clothes. They'd been working in the rice fields. And her father, mother came in, and brothers. And we got up there at the altar, and it's the only wedding I've ever seen that was like this. We faced the audience. The preacher had his back to the people, Mr. Blackman, and he had us say our vows, and then from there we went to the house and we had a dinner, and they stood a little while there. I didn't know where I was going or anything like that. I didn't have very much money to go anywhere. And Herbie said, "Well, you're coming into our house," which was in Baytown. And they had an old Ford. So Doris and I got in the back seat, and Herbie took me on a tour of Exxon. Well, it was Humble at that time. There's that, and that's it. I said, yeah. I was almost falling asleep trying to stay awake. And we got to the house, and they gave us their bed. They had another fold-away or something in the other room, in the living room. And so they slept in that room, and we slept in ours. Well, Herbie was learning to be a photographer at that time, and so alongside the bed was a plank that he was using as a desk, all pictures all over the place. And we didn't have very much sleep. We were so tired. Herbie had, for some reason, had given both of us a drink, a slow gin. It slowed me up real good, but because I was not good for nothing. And but we finally fell asleep. And the next morning we woke up. There at the foot of the bed was another couple that lived next door. They had come in and they wanted to see the newlyweds. And so Jane brought them right there at the foot of the bed, looking down at us. And Godkins was their last name. And stood there maybe 5 minutes talking to us. And finally they left. We got up and got dressed, had breakfast. And I'm trying to remember the rest of the day. Oh, we went back to Katy the next day. And when we got there, the town was just a small town, maybe 1,000 people at the max. They had a basketball game in the elementary gym, and everybody was there. Not everybody, but the big majority, family and everything. So we went to there, and walked from the bus station up to it, about a mile, and for some reason, Doris's mother disappeared after a while, and we stayed to see the end of the game. I believe it was one of her brothers was playing, and we all walked to the house. When we no sooner got there, they had punch out, and they had little cookies and things like that all set out, and a banging on the house. We were chivaried. Do you know what they banged, made a lot of noise, and then they finally had to be invited in. And all the rest of the family, all her cousins, and it was a small little house, and it was pretty well bursting at the seams, if you want to say it. But anyway, they were all there, and we finally got to bed, maybe about 11 o'clock at night, and I had to leave that next morning. I got an asthma attack that night, and I was in no condition to get on that bus. But Doris called the doctor that they used, old country doctor, and he met me in the office and gave me a shot of adrenaline, and well, anyway, adrenaline was the main, and it settled me down, and I got on the bus, bid my wife goodbye, and got back to camp. My asthma was gone. I had no symptoms of it, and so about 5 days later we got on the train, and that's the one that went all over the United States before we got to Portland. And we were in Portland about 8 days, marching most of the time, went to Portland for a few rest times, rest areas, or whatever you want to call it. It's have a few beers. I went bowling one time. I shot about a 90, which was very bad. But anyway, got on the boat, and there was something like 4,000 on the Côte de Peru. And they started out, it was about 11 o'clock when we boarded the ship. Finally found our bunks, which were 4 or 5 stacked high down in the hole. And about that much space to get into and slide in there and lay down. But the next morning, they passed over a bar after they hit the harbor, and the rough water started just about the time for breakfast. And the rails were full, the bathrooms were full. You can tell I'm still a landlubber when I say bathrooms. And fellas would get their trays and be walking to their table, never make it, right in their tray. Well, I, for one, for some reason, did not get seasick. That, I'm not saying that I didn't get sick on that because I got ptomaine poison, I think twice. And from the seawater, we couldn't wash our utensils very good, and it always had a greasy scum. And it got me twice. And but anyway, they came down to San Diego and pulled in there for 1 or 2 days. Couldn't leave ship or anything like that. And we headed out into the sea. no escort, just that one old freighter that if it was doing max, I think 18 miles an hour, 18 knots an hour was the fastest it would ever go. Uh, in the middle of the ocean somewhere, he stopped dead. All the machinery was shut down while they operated on the young man. He passed away. He had been on maneuvers with us, and he had had his Jeep overturned and pinned him, and he had a head injury. And he had been in hospital for several days, and they released him. But the next day he was on sick call again, and the following day sick call, sick call, sick call. And they finally said, well, he's code breaking. But he wasn't. He had a brain concussion, and it must have started a clot or something in his head, and he never made New Guinea. But anyway, after that, we started our tour all over the South Pacific. It took us 50 some odd days from when we originally got on the ship in Portland. There was time we hit Melanie Bay. That was a large harbor. You couldn't see the far shore. But when we pulled in there, the last meal we had was salt herring. And it must have been the last bit of food on there because it was not worth eating. We had run out of water, one canteen a day, and no freshwater baths. We couldn't wash our utensils. And man, everybody went crazy when we got to that harbor. And they allowed us to go on shore. There was nothing there but palm trees and coconuts and land. But a lot of the boys got the coconuts that were on the ground, which supposedly were no good. But anyway, this one boy, Hencke, he decided to climb a tree, a palm tree, and he got up halfway and he slipped, and down he came, landed between two stumps, and it stunned him, but they took him to the hospital, but they brought him back in about a day. That's all. It just knocked the wind out of him. And we got on our ship. They loaded us up with more provisions, and during the entire day they kept on coming out in these amphibious trucks. At about midnight, this black, I mean, no stars, no nothing. One pulled up to the side of the ship, and just about the time that they either got the ropes down to it or what, it swamped, and down it went. And it left all those colored fellas. This is the service company that was, and they were floating around out in that dark in the middle of the bay, sharks and all of that. And everybody threw ropes or whatever we could down in life preservers. And several fellas even jumped off the side of the ship to swim out to them and bring them back. Of course, they'd hang on to these wooden crates that might have been vegetables or something that could float. And anyway, they brought them all back, and one fella climbed up the rope. And first thing he says, I was transferring to the cooks tomorrow. And he was white, kind of a no color, undercolor, if you know what I mean. But anyway, we got on started out the next day, and we headed for Finch Haven. And took 2 days, I think, and got to Finch Haven, pulled up, landed. There was a landing strip. No, we pulled onto a dock that they had out there, and we were still on old Côte de Peru, and we unloaded there, and we went to a camp that they had set up for the new replacements or whatever you want to call us, and it was mud. It was mud everywhere, and it rained cats and dogs that night. We had to draw out our cots, find a tent, put it up in about 2 or 3 inches of water, and our barracks bags, trying to keep them dry, get the cot put down, and then the barracks bag on top of it, and that's the way we didn't do anything else but lay down and went to sleep. And the next morning, we saw the camp, and around the kitchen, the mud bubbled, continuous, just gases coming out of that, so rotten, stunk. They had mosquito wire around to keep out the flies that they could, but they got in there and they were all over the food. We had corned beef hash for breakfast, and went for lunch. We had corned beef hash for lunch. If we went for supper, we had corned beef hash for supper. And the next day was a repeat. And I think after the third or fourth day, we couldn't even stand even saying corned beef hash. But the weekend was coming up, and they had a treat for us. They had lamb or mutton. You could see the carcasses that they had laid out on their tables before cooking. And they were all covered with flies. But some of the boys had to go to KP on that day, and they asked us when we went through the line, what do you want, lamb stew or corned beef hash? I ate corned beef hash. But the way they asked us, lamb stew and flies, because they were in that stew. And anyway, it continued like that with the same corned beef hash. And we got our area to camp in. I don't know, I think almost 7 days after we landed on Finch Haven. And we went out and saw several places where other outfits had been and moved out. And they'd always leave something behind them. I spotted some boxes, and we were out on reconnoitering and trying to find some supplies and everything. We hadn't drawn any yet, and found 3 boxes of unmarked cans. So we brought them back to our kitchen, and you know what it was, corned beef hash. But anyway, we had pancakes. I don't know how our mess lieutenant was able to manage it, or where he got it, or what, but we were the only outfit that had my company. The rest of the battalion, I believe, had corned beef hash. But they'd usually send out, they call for a 3-man detail going for supplies, and we usually send 3 bowmen went along with them to see what they could get. Sticky. And this one time I was on the supply deal, And we got to this area where all the supplies were, and there in the center of that was a great big pile of broken boxes. And we could see cans and everything else like in there. And we asked what they were going to burn them. They were all damaged, they said. Well, I went up to it, and I found, I think, a box of sardines or mackerel. I think it was mackerel in tomato sauce, kind of a oval can, not circle, but elongated. But anyway, I got 6 of them. That's all I could carry. Got back to the truck, and man, I opened up one, and I ate that thing up so fast that it was history. But I had to change to the other truck, and I left my cans there. Well, they were gone when I got back to camp. But anyway, we went out on a beer, our first ration, and we had 6 men again and a lieutenant, and we had to pull into an alcove, beer boxes on both sides, and then in the back where we had to drive up to, back into, and they had fellows keeping track of how many boxes of beer that they put on our truck. Well, every so often one would accidentally drop, and I was underneath the truck. I wired 2 of those boxes up to the frame, and I don't know whether that was all we got out of there with extra or what, but we shared it all after we got out of there. And the captain was given instructions, how to pass it out. And he says, give all 6 cans, he said, let them do them some good. Well, they weren't cold or anything, but our sandy beach was only maybe 1,000 yards. They were all sand, maybe not that far, 1,000 feet from the sea. And you could dig down there and hit water, cool, and you could bury it, and it would take that coolness into it. Well, Lieutenant Campbell, and we could see their tent from where we were, and he was in there with the other lieutenants. So he was smart. He went out, dug a hole, he put his 6 cans down in there, covered them up, and he waited for them to get cool. But he was called out for some other assignment, and he had to leave the camp area. Well, he was no sooner out of sight, but the other lieutenants all dug up his 6 cans and moved them 10 or 15 feet away, redug another hole, put them down in there, and covered it up, covered the other place up. And when he came back, well, he was in the mood for a beer. And he went out there to dig one up. And he dug, and he dug. And I think he dug for 4 hours before the other fellas finally said, all right, here's where they are. And gave them back to him. But
What happened next? When did you get your tanks and all of that?
oh, it was about 3, maybe a month before we got our tanks. And they were different than what we had trained on. We had trained on with a Ford engine and 8-cylinder, great big, immense thing. But these were radial engines, right, whirlwind in aviation engines. And of course, we were in the tropics, so that was the best thing, air conditioned. We didn't have to have hot water or cold water that would be too hot. And we got those, and we had to clean all the cosmoline off of all the guns and all of that, and get them ready. And then the orders came after 1 or 2 trips. We couldn't use their roads anymore because we were chewing them up. And so we had to stick to the beaches. And some of the tanks would throw a track in the sand, but mine never did for some reason. And we took up and down, and finally a call came. They needed 6 tank volunteers. I don't know whether they actually volunteered, but they took 2 tanks from every company. And they invaded Newport Island, and they had secured the airfield there. The tanks were sitting out around it, protecting it, and the Marines had an airdrop. And they came in, and they all jumped, and they all hung up, majority of them hung up in the palm trees surrounding that area. And if it hadn't been for the tankers securing that area, they'd have been wiped out. And here in the States, there's a great big headline, Marines take Newport Island airfield. And we already had it. Well, I wasn't there, but they've already been on the field for at least 2 hours. And that was the first taste of combat that any of us had.